Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today I'm doing my March wrap-up. In March, I actually participated in 2 readathons, and somehow I actually read fewer books this month than last month. In March, I was planning to slow down on my reading a little bit, so while I was participating in these readathons, I wasn't really striving to read as much as I possibly could. I just wanted to participate and follow people on Twitter and things and see how much people were reading, which was really fun. So in March, I read 6 books. The first book that I read was part of a readathon. I participated in the Readathon by Zoe, which is a 24-hour readathon that happened on March 3rd, I think. So for that, I had quite a long TBR for it, but I really only got through one and a third of a book. But the first book that I read was A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness. This follows a young boy whose mother is sick and kind of how he deals with that and all of the emotional turmoil that he goes through because of it. In this, there is a monster that shows up that only the boy can see, and the monster kind of helps him process all of this experience. Going into this, I didn't really know what to expect, but I really enjoyed this one. I thought it was very well done. It is very, very sad, but I really liked the way that the story was put together and also the illustrations that are in this book. So this book has a lot of illustrations. Let's see if I can find one. So here's one of the illustrations in the book, and what I really loved about these is that they really added something to the reading experience of this book. I love any book that has illustrations in it, that's always fun, but they don't always add to the reading experience or to how the story is told. But this one, I don't think that the experience of reading the book would have been the same without these illustrations. They have this very visceral feeling that really adds to the vibe. So I thought this one was very well done, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read, I started as part of the readathon, but I didn't get to finish it, which was Silence Fallen by Patricia Briggs. This is the 10th book in her Mercy Thompson series. This is a urban fantasy series that follows Mercy Thompson, who is a mechanic and also is able to shapeshift into a coyote. This story has shapeshifters, werewolves, vampires, fae, all kinds of creatures. As I said, this is the 10th one in the series, so this is a series that I have been following for quite a long time. This was not my favorite in this series. This one, I can't really explain that much of what happened in it because it's the 10th book. But in it, Mercy gets kidnapped by a rival group of magical creatures, and then her friends have to go find her. She actually ends up in Europe, which was interesting because I think none of the books before this have left the United States. So this was the first one where she ended up outside the United States in Europe, and she kind of encounters some new magical creatures because of that. But this one incorporated a golem, which is a Jewish folk tale, and personally, I don't really like golem stories. It also tends to be a very sad story and creature. I think it's really hard to do a golem story well. I have yet to see a story of a golem that I'm oh, that was a good choice to include the golem because you did it really well. So this one, I was kind of eh about it. I didn't really like the golem aspect. I do enjoy the characters from this story, especially since I've been following them so long, so I still had fun reading it, but this definitely was not my favorite of the series, and I gave it 3.5 stars. After reading Silence Fallen, I was looking at my TBR shelf and thinking about how I have a lot of unread books that I need to get to, and yet for some reason I keep buying books. It becomes a vicious cycle, but it was starting to stress me out how many unread books I have, and I'm no, this is supposed to be fun. Reading is a fun hobby. So my obvious response to feeling overwhelmed by all of my unread books is to reread a book. I also wanted to reread something because in January and February, with the exception of one book, I didn't really like most of the books I was reading. So I was okay, I'm gonna reread some books and just read something that I know I'm gonna love because I've already read it and loved it. Anyway, that's a long introduction. The next book that I read was Seer of Seven Waters by Juliet Marillier. This is the 5th book in her Seven Waters series. I have been rereading this entire series because Juliet Marillier is one of my favorite authors, and I love this series by her. This is a historical fantasy set in Ireland. This series follows the family of Seven Waters through the generations, so each book has a different protagonist, but it is different women in the same family going through the generations. This one follows Sybil, who has been training to become a druid, but before she can be inducted into the Order of the Druids, her teacher wants her to take some time to reflect and really decide if this is the life path that she wants. So she goes to visit her two sisters who live on an island which has kind of a warrior combat school. And so while Sybil is visiting her sisters, there is a shipwreck on the island and some strangers come ashore. Only a couple of people survive, but that's what kind of starts off the whole story and a new adventure for them. Going into this, I knew that this one was actually my least favorite of the series when I read it the first time. Even so, I knew that I was gonna love it because, like, I love anything by Juliet Marillier. It's just like, compared to her other books, it was not my fave. But I actually really enjoyed it this time around. All of her previous books have primarily been set in Seven Waters, so it has this very like woodsy, foresty vibe. This one takes place on a rocky island, so it has a very different setting. Knowing that, going into it the second time, I really loved this book. I also just loved her writing. I've been reading a lot of books recently that I just like didn't connect to the writing that much, and so reading this was like a breath of fresh air. And this may seem dramatic, but while I was reading this, I was like, I feel like this is just healing my soul. Maybe just like my reader soul, but still, it was just making me so happy. Just how much I love her writing. It is very lyrical, and I just find that kind of writing so enjoyable and engaging and immersive and just wonderful to read. These books do tend to be very slow. They are definitely books that are more into depth versus breadth, so there will be long periods of time where it seems like not a ton of stuff is happening. There's not a lot of like action, but the experience of reading these books is just so wonderful. I don't even care if anything happens in these books. They do have very enjoyable plots, but to me it's more the experience as a whole of just reading it that I love so much. My only complaint about this book is that there is a love interest in it. So all of these books have a love interest of some sort, and that is very fun. I love a good love story. Who doesn't? But I felt like for this particular story and this character, I would have preferred actually if there wasn't a love interest or there wasn't a love story. I think it would have been more interesting and would have felt more authentic to the character, because Sybil, her whole life has felt a connection to the gods and has felt that this is her calling to become a druid and to live this solitary life, that she wouldn't be able to be married, she would be a druid and dedicate her life to the gods. And while this was resolved in a way that I thought was acceptable, I just really wish that there hadn't been a love interest at all. So that was my only complaint about this, that I kind of felt like it would have been more authentic to this character and more interesting as a story if she had really not had any love interest and not had that like conflict of interest. But other than that, I really loved this book and I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. So then I participated in another readathon, which was the rereadathon, which, as you may be able to guess, is a readathon completely dedicated to rereading books. And I love rereading books, and I was kind of already rereading books, so I was like, I'm super into this, let's do it. Before that, I actually was still reading Seer of Seven Waters, so I finished up the last little bit of this book. And then the next book that I read for that was The Fairy Godmother by Mercedes Lackey. This is another reread, obviously, which takes place in a fairy tale world. This world has a kind of magic that is called the tradition, which is this sort of worldwide magic that if your life in any way starts to resemble a myth, a fairy tale, a story, folk tale, whatever it is, this magic from the world called the tradition tries to force your life to follow that fairy tale exactly. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's not so good. Fairy godmothers are people who have magic who then try to help people who are trapped in these fairy tale lives. They either help people along to finding their happy endings if they are in a happy fairy tale, or they try and break people out of the unhappy fairy tales and make their lives not be so terrible, because some fairy tales are really sad. So this follows a girl named Elena who starts off as a Cinderella retelling, but then she becomes a fairy godmother. So we get to see how the fairy godmothers work in this world and how they shape the tradition and kind of nudge people in the right direction to help them out. So this is the first one in a series. This is a little bit different from all of the other books in this series because the rest of the books follow characters who are just in their fairy tales. Each book follows a different character and a different fairy tale, and Elena, this fairy godmother, shows up in some of them as their fairy godmother. But this is the only one that directly follows the fairy godmother. Rereading this one, I did like it. I don't think I liked it as much as I used to. I probably will be continuing the series at least for another 1 to 2 books to see what I think of it. I like the premise and the idea of this book. I think that it is really interesting to have this kind of metacognitive experience of the world and its magic, because we're following the fairy godmother. We have sort of an outside perspective, which I think is really interesting. But I wasn't a huge fan of the writing. It wasn't like bad writing. It was just kind of plain. And as I have said, I tend to prefer more lyrical writing. Overall, I did enjoy reading this and I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. And next up, I have Chasers of the Light by Tyler Knott Gregson. This is a book of poetry where he has written all of his poems on a typewriter on different random pieces of paper and then like either photographed or scanned them in. So you get some really random things in here. There's a piece of graph paper. Here's a receipt that he typed on. And I really enjoyed this one. This is actually one I recently just had midterms because I'm in grad school. And at one point I was taking a break and I was like, oh, I'll just read some poetry because I don't want to get like sucked into a story. So I opened this up and I came to a poem that was very much inspirational, you can do it kind of stuff. And I was just like, this may be dramatic, but this is what I need right now because I'm like in the middle of midterms and just dying a little bit. I always have a really hard time explaining why I like certain poetry more than others, but I really liked his writing and I enjoyed this one a lot. So I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. And finally, I have The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. This is one that you may have seen in previous videos, different weekend reading updates. I would talk about wanting to finish this one. This is a science fiction book that is on my Science Fiction Through the Decades. This is my 50s book for that challenge. If you want to see the other books on my TBR for this reading challenge, I will link it down below. But as I said, I am reading a science fiction book from every decade. This is the one from the 50s. This one takes place in a future London where there are killer alien plants called triffids. Then one day there is this event that happens where there are these lights in the sky and most of the world goes blind. You follow a man and a woman who are some of the few people who are still able to see. They find each other and then they find another group of people and they kind of have to re-establish a new society because now they have to figure out how to live in this world where they have these killer plants hunting them, and they have to live in this world where the majority of people are blind, so that affects how they can interact with the world. This one I was not a big fan of. It took me a very long time to read. I think I started reading this in like January and I just kept not getting to it. This is a tiny book. It's not even 200 pages. I just didn't like it that much for some reason. I didn't have a real reason. It just didn't grab me. It didn't draw me in. The only reason that I finished it is because it was on my TBR for that challenge and I didn't want to have to find a different book for the 50s. Otherwise, I definitely would have DNF'd this book. I really wanted to just put it down and not finish it. But I made it through and I finished this one and I gave it 2.5 out of 5 stars. So that is all for my March wrap up. I think my favorite book this month was Seer of Seven Waters. I definitely was freaking out about how much I loved that book. Let me know in the comments what your favorite book was that you read in March. Thank you all for watching and until next time, bye!